Climate change is a controversial topic that plays a major role in our socio-political and scientific landscape. In this podcast, we are going to step away from the controversy and instead focus on the scientific observations and the subtleties of how changes in our climate can have tragic, paradoxical, interesting, and even quirky results on life on this planet, so that we can have a better understanding of the world to make informed choices in our lives. Welcome to the Ketogeek podcast. Let's do this.
Health, nutrition, fitness, low-carb lifestyle.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Ketogeek podcast. My name is Fahad, and I will be solo hosting this show today. Guys and gals, there's so many things that are going on these days. I really had to make everything really compact and organized so I can burn through everything that I wanted to share with all of you. First of all, thank you so much for being here with me throughout this journey. If you are a long-term listener, we got some very interesting news for you, especially if you're a customer of our Ketogeek products. Well, so I have 4 big news, just to be really specific. The first one is that our white chocolate strawberry flavor that we've been teasing for a while is now available in stock. It is getting rave reviews. It really pairs well with wine when you freeze it. And you may ask, why is that the case? Well, simply put, the fatty flavor coats your mouth, and then the alcohol from the wine just cuts through that and resets your palate. It is a match made in heaven. So even some of our winemaker friends here in Napa are loving this combination. So expect this trend to grow over the next few months and even the next few decades and years to come. The second big news is that we are about to launch our 4th flavor as well, which by the time this podcast will be out, expected to be there in stock. We are literally synchronizing the release of this podcast with the launch of our flavor. And the flavor is called the Breakfast Mocha Noir. You may ask, why is it named that way? Well, there are some simple explanations, but to make everything very simple, it contains cocoa powder, and it also contains coffee beans in it, lightly roasted coffee beans. We tried the dark roast in this flavor, but it turned out to be really musky, dark, and burnt. Didn't turn out to be that good. Light roasted beans seem to do really well, and it captures all the fruity and floral notes of coffee, unlike anything ever. And we're making a very bold claim here, but it's so true. If you've tried the traditional water extracted coffee, whether it is at a coffee house or anywhere, basically, that's how universally coffee is made. But we're doing a fat extraction, which captures pretty much everything that comes with the coffee beans. And when you have a lightly roasted coffee bean, which isn't tormented to the end of the world to burn all the flavors through, then what you get is something really special, really complete. And combine that with the black chocolate that we use, it is really amazing. The flavor profile is very intense. And even a coffee snob of ours here in Napa said to us that this is the first time I've had coffee, quotes. That's a big statement. That is huge. So you have to try this out. What's really cool is that the Breakfast Mocha Noir flavor will contain 9 grams of protein, which is equivalent to about an egg and a half. That's why we're saying it's breakfast, because, we can equate that to the amount of protein that you can get from an egg. It also contains 40 milligrams of caffeine, which is about a cup or so. It's not super high like Starbucks or any of those big venti cups that are out there, but it is enough to get you the kicker. It also contains various types of fats, whether it is our short, medium, or long chain triglycerides. It's got it all. It also comes packed with nutrients that are ground from cacao and coffee beans. So all in all, you're getting a very good product, completely shelf-stable, sugar-free, all that jazz. So let's pause for a second and go grab some of these Breakfast Mocha Noir energy pods or the white chocolate strawberry energy pod. Anyway, so now the third thing that I wanted to really talk about is that we finally started to get into stores in Napa. And the two that we are in stock right now is Board Garden and Jeffrey's General, which is in downtown Napa. You can plug them into your GPS. If you are ever in Napa and want to support Ketogeek and the local businesses, you can do that. Local businesses are very important. They're the heart of the city. They make the city what it is. So we need to put everything out there for them, especially after COVID. Go out there, support them, support us. Let's change the world for the better. The fourth big news I have to say is that we have started a new channel called Energy Pod TV, which you can find on Instagram at keto_geek, or you can find it on our Ketogeek YouTube channel, or even on our Ketogeek website. What's really cool about that is that instead of focusing on the extreme science, we're focusing more on the food industry, the backstage information, what it takes to make the energy pod. So it's a much more intimate experience, even a more visual, because these are all videos. It shows you how energy pods are made. It distills all the information from complexity to simplicity. For example, when we did a podcast on chocolate over here, it was very in-depth. We're not going to talk about those extreme concepts. What we're going to focus on is something a bit more simple and more practical. We are going to talk about the food industry as well and explain the nuances behind it. So expect those episodes to be very information loaded as well. So all of this information was for people who are already listening to Ketogeek. But if you're new to Ketogeek, let me give you guys a brief information session. Just give me a few minutes and I'll talk to you about it. So what is Ketogeek? We're technically a food business that uses the best science to create the best food products using hand-picked ingredients. And we go through countless scientific papers to provide you with relevant information in a sea of ultra-processed information overload. Guys, that's the problem of our time. Ultra-processed information. Then we also take all of this information and apply it right into our product called Energy Pods, which are a food emulsion made from these ingredients, these really high-end ingredients. And what you get inside these Energy Pods is something very special. These Energy Pods are 2-ounce or about 56 gram cups containing experimental sugar-free emulsions that we make ourselves here in the sunny Napa, California. Using science-backed, hand-picked ingredients that we can find. All these great ingredients, unlike anything that you can find in the market. How do you eat them? Well, you can put them in the fridge and they turn into a pudding. You can use the paperboard spoon that comes with them and makes a beautiful dessert. If you can also freeze the Energy Pods and it turns into an ice cream texture, really creamy, thick, viscous. You can melt them and use them at room temperature, and it turns into somewhat of a dipping sauce or a spread. So it works in 3 different ways in this regard. And if you come up with a creative idea to use the Energy Pods, just tag us in a photo or send us an email. We want to know what you guys do with our Energy Pods. Honestly, they're so tasty, people just eat them as is as soon as they get their hands on it. It's really that good. And then they end up with their hungers curb stomped, which is also really cool. The texture of the Energy Pods, what we describe it as, is fattier than fat. Why do we say that? Because they're so viscous, creamy, flavorful, and filling. You have to try it to actually know what it's all about. You can go get even like a single Energy Pod and you'll be able to understand what all of this is all about. And the way we obtain this really amazing texture is by processing all of the ingredients in a methodical and surgical way for about 48 to 72 hours. So in a nutshell, it takes 3 to 4 days to make one of these Energy Pods. But it's worth it. It's really worth it. The way I consume Energy Pods is, especially the chocolate one, is by taking some sugar-free chocolate chips and putting them into the Energy Pod at room temperature. Then I'll refrigerate that pod in the fridge for 15 minutes. Then I will top it up with some whipped cream and some chopped strawberries. And that will be my late night dessert. It is so darn tasty. Once you try this, I doubt you're going to go back to any of the diluted desserts that you get in the market. It's just so compact. The Energy Pods are completely shelf-stable. But as our retailers and customers, and as we are also finding out, they seem to taste best when chilled. It reminds me of how soda works. Don't drink soda, not the sugary ones at least. But this is how the soda works. You can consume them at room temperature and they may taste good or okay, but when you refrigerate them, it just goes to a whole new level. But honestly, in the case of energy pods, they really taste good even at shelf, at room temperature. They're that good. The sweeteners that we use in energy pods are monk fruit and erythritol. One of our friends actually ran through our chocolate fudge energy pod through the continuous glucose monitor, and they gave it a solid thumbs up. So what we do kind of works really well, actually. Erythritol is a completely inert sweetener, which is about 60% sweetness of sugar. It has been studied in many trials and has shown to have no impact on blood sugar and insulin. It is very, very friendly towards your stomach as well compared to some of the other sweeteners that are out there, such as maltitol and xylitol. It's even better than allulose or rare sugar. Monk fruit is the second sweetener that we use, which is very special. Special? What am I saying? Special. Monk fruit, it's basically a concentrated antioxidant, about 300 times sweeter than sugar, and possesses some antimicrobial properties. All of these sweeteners are so good. Like sugar really screws up with your teeth. Our sweeteners actually may have protective capabilities. Your dentist will be proud and out of business. Well, I doubt they will be. They'll probably find something else. That's the thing about the health industry. You overcome one challenge and the next one shows up. We continue evolving. But when it comes to fat, we have MCT oils, we have ghee, we have almonds and various nuts. In the case of the pecan coconut, there's pecans involved as well, and coconut butter. So this is really, really like different kinds of fats that are involved in there from animal sources, from plant sources, whether it's in short chain, medium chain, or long chain triglycerides. We got it all covered. What's really cool is that one of the ingredients we use in the energy pods is ghee, and we make the ghee ourselves here in Napa, California, using pasture-raised butter that is literally 45 minutes away from us, using humanely treated cows. So we care about everybody. We care about the environment, the cows, animals, life, humans. What's also really interesting is that the paperboard spoon that comes with the energy pods, that supports regenerative forestry and is made by a company 45 minutes away from us. So everything that we do, we really care about it. But above all, I think what we pride ourselves most on is the fact that we don't have any ties, we don't have any co-packers, we don't have any thing that really pushes us to cut corners when it comes to our ingredients. And that's all because of you guys, whether you're our podcast listeners who are leaving us reviews or buying our products, or anybody who's out there who's saying Ketogeek all over the place. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. And together we can usher in a better food revolution. We've got some stellar reviews on Energy Pods. One of our customers is Victoria. She's a verified customer who has purchased our product in the past, and she said the following words, quote, "I really enjoyed the richness and smoothness of the chocolate fudge. This is a great option when you want a nice treat. I have been buying this off and on for the last 2 years. The customer service and shipping was great." This is pertaining to the newer version, like the finalized version of a chocolate fudge energy pod. We spent about 3 years sort of quasi finishing it, but these last couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks, we finalized our product using the processing that we really wanted to use. Even people who aren't keto and low carb are leaving us reviews, such as this one, which is from Trish, who says that, quote, "Loved it, and I don't even follow the keto diet, just wanted something for a bit of a dessert, and I was not disappointed. It's super thick and rich. Had it alongside a nice glass of red wine. Totally recommend it." This was pertaining to our white chocolate strawberry flavor. You can buy the energy pods at www.ketogeek.com or even on Amazon Prime. Well, the chocolate fudge energy pod is on Prime. The other ones are not. If you subscribe to a box of the energy pods every month, you get a 10% discount and can be delivered to your doorstep every month. That really supports us and puts life on autopilot. Each box contains 8 energy pods. Each energy pod is about 2 ounce, similar to like a craft premium chocolate bar, but in a cup form. We also allow customers to buy singles or doubles. You don't have to buy a box. and it ships with free shipping. We don't add any extraneous costs with it, with our energy pod and all the shipment and all that kind of jazz, so that you can have a peace of mind. It takes about 2 to 3 days to get it to your doorstep. You also get a handwritten note from us explaining what the product is, how you can consume it, some recommendations, perhaps some notes about the batches. It's a very intimate experience. So all in all, think about it. It's a win-win situation everywhere. And, let's change the world. Leave us reviews too. It really helps, especially for this podcast and the product everywhere. So now that we have done a lot of house cleaning, let's talk about this show, which I was looking forward to because Thor Hanson has been our guest in the past. He is a very passionate guy. So let me give you guys a little bit of a bio before we delve into the show itself. Thor Hanson is an author, Guggenheim Fellow, a Switzer Environmental Fellow, and an independent conservation biologist. He received his bachelor's from University of Redland, master's from University of Vermont's Field Naturalist program, and doctorate through University of Idaho joint program. He consults various conservation groups and government agencies, while he has also co-hosted PBS Nature series American Spring Live and has been a guest on many programs from NPR's Fresh Air to On Point, Science Friday, The World, The Splendid Table, and Book Lust with Nancy Pearl. He is the author of the books Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, which was the book we're going to talk about today. Also, Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds, which was what we talked about the previous time when he was around. Then Feathers and the Impenetrable Forest, as well as children's illustrated favorite Bartholomew Quill. I think I butchered some of the pronunciation there. It actually sounds like Harry Potter. Like all of his books, I would expect them to be course books at Hogwarts. God, I'm so nerdy. He has won many awards and distinctions such as John Burroughs Medal, Phi Beta Kappa Awards in Science, 3 Pacific Northwest Book Awards, and many more. His articles have appeared in publications such as Wall Street Journal, Times of London, Los Angeles Times, The American Scholar, The Guardian, and the Huffington Post. What's really fascinating, you will notice on this show, is that Thor is very passionate. He is a genuine guy who really cares about the work he does, true to his word. And guys, enjoy the joyride. Let's do this.
I have long had an interest in biology, grew up as the kid who had the, snakes and lizards in the aquarium and that sort of thing out in nature quite a bit. But it was really for me mostly a hobby, something I enjoyed doing until I got to university. And I was in a place in Southern California that had been really developed, and there wasn't much natural landscape left in that area. And it really alerted in me a feeling of what was at risk when we develop lands and as our populations grow, because I came from a very rural place. And so suddenly I had this real interest in conservation, and I realized that what had been sort of a hobby and a pastime for me was going to be a career. And so I studied conservation biology and went through the sort of, master's and doctorate and these sorts of things. And then as I got more and more into these academic pursuits, I became more and more alarmed by how many fascinating discoveries and stories in science never seemed to make it beyond the relatively limited audience of peer review and publications. Those are really important parts of science, of course, and how we get discoveries done and research done. But there are all these great ideas that didn't seem to be getting beyond that. And so that got me interested in doing some more storytelling about science and starting to write for a popular audience. And now the bulk of my career really is dedicated towards science communication, writing about science and getting out and lecturing and telling some of those great stories.
So after reading your current book that your publisher sent me, I think and I've gone through about 1/3 to 1/4 of it, and I still need to finish it. But I think that's a good way to leave everybody else as sort of like a teaser so that they can go buy the book as well. Because one of the things that I like about your personality and the way you write and explain things is there's hardcore, pure passion involved in it. I can notice that from the pictures inside the book itself. This time I got to see the pictures. Last time I think it was an audiobook. And so I noticed the subtlety, like all the way down to the minuscule level. So is that something that you think just came through your childhood experiences, or how does one develop that? The subtlety and the depth?
Sure. I think that getting out and looking closely is a really important part, not just of science, but of our interactions with nature. You know, we tend to erect a wall, sort of an imaginary wall between the natural world and the human world. And I'm really interested in getting through that, because it's really an imaginary wall. I mean, we're part of nature. And if we can break down those barriers, we see a lot more. Oftentimes, we have learned the opposite. We have developed these ways of blocking out information, which is essential for us as we go through daily life. Imagine trying to walk down the street if you weren't blocking out information. You know, all the advertisements and the ringtone on someone's cell phone would be distracting to you. The cars going. I mean, so there's so much information blasting at us all day long. We have to block some out just to get through the day. But in doing that, in erecting those barriers, we also block out the songs of the birds around us, and we block out the small creatures moving through the shrubbery alongside the road, and all of those subtle clues that tell us constantly that we are still part of nature. We tend to block those out as well. So I think when we can break down those barriers, pause, investigate, look closely. And by look, I mean not just with our eyes, but with all of our senses. We can really reconnect some of those ancient pathways of communication between our perceptions and the natural world. And you start seeing things that you realize, hey, you know, I've been walking by this stuff my whole life and never noticed it.
So run me through a normal day of yours, like a normal day, and then run me through a day of when you go out and explore something.
Well, now here's a good comparison. What I would love for your listeners to take away is that those things don't have to be separate. They don't have to be separate if you allow yourself to hear more and see more in your normal day. And I'll give you an example just from the weekend, because it occurred just yesterday afternoon when I was helping my wife with some chores. We live in a rural area, but we were out in our sort of barn-like shed, you know, cleaning up and tidying up things and so on, and talking about where we were going to build these shelves, and we're busy with our own, you know, very human-centered things. And I heard this tiny sound, and I said, hey, geese. And we ran out and looked up at the sky, and my son was there too, and he looked up, and far above us up in the sky was a beautiful V of migrating snow geese passing over us. And the only clue there was just the tiniest little honking sound. And I think that demonstrates that when you start to break down those barriers and you train yourself to listen and look out for clues from nature, they break through even when you're busy doing quote unquote normal things.
So you're basically living the Disney style dream where, you know, you're just having a normal day and suddenly the music starts popping in and you're just like, let's just have a fun party, dance around and just explore the place. Is that how you feel like it?
You know, it's not always Disney, but I do feel like we have these opportunities around us. You know, right now I'm speaking to you from an office in the town near where we live, which I've been sharing with some other folks because it has good internet. That's one drawback from a rural lifestyle. We don't have particularly good internet at home, but it's fine here. And I'm looking out, and it's a typical sort of, you know, town urban style setting with concrete and buildings and so forth. And I was just remembering that last summer, right on the sidewalk outside here, there was a tiny leafcutter bee building a nest in the cracks between the sidewalk. And I only noticed it because here comes this tiny insect carrying a big chunk of leaf, like this big green flag through the air. And I thought, what on earth is that creature doing? And then saw it disappear into its hole right here in town, in the most developed little area that I can think of near where we live. That natural history is still going on.
So how did you transition and move into writing this specific book? And you can name drop it here as well.
Sure. So the new book is called Hurricane Lizards and Plastic Squid, The Fraught and Fascinating Biology of Climate Change. Kind of a mouthful, but it really does summarize what I wanted to do with this book. And that was sort of get us to look beyond the polar bear, if you will. If you think about the biology of climate change and the impacts on plants and animals, the iconic image that we have from long experience now is the polar bear stranded on a shrinking iceberg. And that's a really important image, of course, but it too often is the beginning and the end of the conversation. And that's the only thing we think about when we think about what's happening out in nature. Oh, the poor polar bear. Well, it is an important story, but we need to get beyond that because there's an amazing array of biological stories playing out all over the world and all around us in our own lives. The plants and animals of the world have been responding and reacting and adapting and even evolving to climate change all along. While we've been arguing about what may be bringing it about, all the other creatures of the planet have been getting on with things. And so if we can go out as biologists or as citizens and see this happening and learn a tremendous amount about the breadth and the scope and the impacts of this crisis, because ultimately what matters is not so much the change itself as the reactions to the change. Because if all plants and animals got along just as well in any condition, then you could tinker with the weather all you want and it wouldn't matter. But of course, when you change these climate patterns, plants, animals, all the species, including our own, respond. And it's those responses that will determine the future. So I wanted to dive into that biology and look at what we can see and measure in the field now. And the stories that I uncovered were fascinating and phenomenal and fraught and all of those things, and certainly worthy of a book.
Yeah. My favorite one, since I've not finished the book, was the beetle one. That one was really interesting. So this makes me curious, actually. Like, what were you thinking? Like, where was the journey? Like, where did it all start when you were writing the book? Like, as an author, as a scientist as well. Like, what were you thinking right as you were writing your first few words or thinking about writing your first few words? How did you even approach this?
Sure. Well, I think you may have already gotten the idea that I really try to incorporate natural history into daily life. You know, whether it's the geese flying overhead or the bee in the sidewalk out front. And that is something that helped inform this book and gave me a way to approach writing it. And one of the first things that I wanted to get my head around was carbon dioxide. And this is, it's the most commonly talked about, but seldom explained thing in modern life, isn't it? We hear about CO2 all the time, carbon emissions and so forth, but we rarely stop to think about it or dive into it or get your hands on some and understand it. And so I did some research into the history of how it was discovered, and I wanted to understand why some carbon dioxide is okay and some carbon dioxide is causing climate change. How can this substance be both a building block for life on Earth as well as a threat to life on Earth? And I learned a tremendous amount about it, but most importantly, learned that distinction, and I did so in part by exploring the contents of my refrigerator. I wanted to find some CO2. It's in the air all around us in a diffuse state, but I wanted to find some concentrated CO2 to see what it was like. And it is the byproduct, of course, of fermentation. One of the first people to study it studied CO2 by looking in the cloud of invisible gas above the tanks at a brewery. This was in the 18th century, and this clergyman and chemist named Joseph Priestley was interested in what is the atmosphere, what's out there, and he realized there's this invisible gas, CO2, that he could measure. And so he learned that it was heavy and it would snuff out a candle flame. He learned that plants and animals, animals particularly, couldn't breathe in it. It was a very different substance. And since he found it in this brewery, I decided I could find it in something rotting in the fridge. And so I found this old jar of pickles. My son and I did this little experiment together. We should have thrown these pickles out ages ago, but I realized that that fermentation in there probably had a pool of CO2 at the top. So we took the jar lid off and put a lit match over the top, and it snuffed out as if we turned off a switch, which explains why CO2 is such a common ingredient in fire extinguishers. It's heavy, it's dense, things can't burn in it, there's no oxygen. Really fascinating stuff. And that led me into thinking about the biology of that pickle jar, and it helps explain why, some CO2 cycles through the atmosphere all the time in a very important and benign way. And that is, it becomes fixed into things like cucumbers and the pickles that we grew in our garden, comes out of the air, carbon dioxide, putting the carbo into carbohydrates. This is photosynthesis, making starches. We all have probably studied this in some basic biology course. And then it goes back into the atmosphere when it rots. But you can slow that rotting process down in a jar of pickles, right? You can slow it down. Those pickles lasted. Those were a little far gone, but they had lasted in there for months, whereas the cucumbers in the garden that rotted in the compost, their CO2 was back in the atmosphere already. So the whole thing really boils down to, and this was my aha moment, was that not all plants rot. Not all plants rot. You can slow that process down completely in certain situations in nature. On the seafloor, if big bunches of algae sink all at once and get buried before they rot or are eaten, that CO2 gets locked away. Same thing happens in boggy wetlands where you get layer upon layer of peat building up. And if those deposits of organic matter get covered up by sediments and rocks, they get locked away for millions of years, building up slowly and slowly and slowly, trapped, brought out of the atmosphere. And those are, of course, the fossil fuels that we are burning now, returning this massive amount of stored carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere at once. So the making of pickles or taking a breath where you exhale carbon dioxide, that's part of the natural cycle of carbon dioxide going on all the time. But when you flood that system with millions of years worth of stored carbon dioxide, it overwhelms the system and leads to all of the consequences that we now see unfolding. So that was the first part of my exploration, was to try to understand the biology really at the heart of this whole process, which I think we tend to gloss over in many of our climate change conversations.
Yes, and your book really delves hardcore into this and beyond just this. Like, one of the most fascinating topic was, like, most of the time people talk about the extinction events, potential extinction events, and the negative sides of it. And though I would say it depends all over the place. I'm not an expert on this topic. So there's one really fascinating thing is how these species adapt. And sometimes there's new life that comes in there when, you would be like, huh? This should have, like, these unexpected results start happening all over the place. So what is one or two things that really stuck out for you when it comes to writing these books? You can talk about a certain story or a certain concept. It's all up to you.
Here is a story that I think really captures what's happening out there, or some of what's happening that we don't hear a lot about. And that is, imagine again that iceberg with the polar bear on it. If you could look beyond the polar bear just to the edge of that ice, you might see this tiny little seabird called the little auk or dovekie, which feeds at the edge of the Arctic ice where there's a lot of plankton, where that ice is melting. It makes a really good habitat for plankton, and the dovekies feed there. And they've long been thought to be particularly vulnerable to climate change, like the polar bears. They depend on that ice. So as the ice retreats, the dovekies' future looks grimmer and grimmer in that they breed on Arctic islands, but the ice is getting farther and farther from those islands, so the birds have to fly farther and farther to bring food back to their chicks. And you can imagine that ultimately it would be too far, and the chicks would starve, the population would collapse. This has been a prediction for decades, until a group of scientists went up to see what was really happening in a place called Franz Josef Land, which is an archipelago in the Arctic in Russia. And these researchers got up there and they attached, satellite tags to the birds that were breeding there, and they had calculated where the sea ice was, and they realized the birds were going to have to fly at least an hour just to get to a place where they could feed. And they wanted to study this, and so they let the birds go, and they got their first batch of data back, and they looked at it. What on earth? They were so stunned because the birds had been in the air for less than 4 minutes, and they realized something had changed, and the birds had found a new source of food that was not just closer, it was right on their doorstep. So they got this, inflatable dinghy that they had at the research site there, and some. It turned out to be bad gas they brought from Murmansk, full of water. But they managed to get this bloody thing started, and they went out to the mouth of that fjord, where this milky blue glacial meltwater from the melting glaciers on the island was slamming into the dark, cold currents of the Arctic Ocean. And that transition was so abrupt that little plankton swimming between those two types of water were stunned, even killed by that transit. It was like driving full speed into a wall for these plankton. And it created a wall, if you will, a curtain of plankton, stunned or dead plankton underwater. The dovekies had found it. They were simply flying 4 or 5 minutes from their nests and stuffing themselves on plankton and flying back again. And immediately the researchers realized that the story of these birds had gone from something dire to something hopeful and resilient, and that the dovekies had the behavioral flexibility to be able to utterly change their lives from what they've been doing for thousands of years and explore first and then exploit this new food source that was right on their doorstep.
That's really, really fascinating. So besides the traditional, the poster child polar bear, what other species have you noticed that are probably in a state of, in a poor state right now? And do you have any example on this that is less known?
Yeah, certainly. So what we see out there, you see examples like the dovekies, where the creatures have flexibility, or what biologists call plasticity, the ability to sort of bend. If you imagine the superhero Plastic Man, who could stretch his arms and legs and so forth into any position, that ability is very crucial right now in nature, because plasticity allows a rapid response to rapid change, and we see rapid change everywhere. So the creatures that are more at risk are those that have less plasticity, and they tend to be specialists, creatures that depend upon a particular habitat, or they depend upon a particular relationship, and they don't have the ability to change quickly the way the dovekies did. Those are the creatures that are most at risk. So you look, then it helps biologists then differentiate between those that have resilience and those that are vulnerable. And you see things like corals, of course, where the symbiosis between the coral polyps that build the reef, these little creatures, and the dinoflagellates or algae that live inside those coral polyps in a symbiotic relationship, that only occurs and continues within a narrow temperature range. If the water gets too hot for most corals, you can imagine the polyps in there. It's sort of like roommates in a small apartment when it gets too hot and they start fighting and eventually someone storms out. Well, what happens in those situations is the coral expel the algae, and you have these bleaching events that can ultimately kill all the corals on the reef. So that is a situation of a very specialized relationship that is very much at risk. Similarly, if you look towards places where animals and plants live only in a particular habitat that's changing fast. And we see this a lot on mountains, and particularly in the tops of mountains. As the temperatures rise, the creatures lower down start climbing the mountains, and the plants too. In many cases, not always, but in many cases, the bulk of the habitat starts shifting upwards. And they're looking, of course, for the temperatures they're used to. It gets hotter, you go up, and it gets cooler, you're back to normal again. But what about the creatures that were already at the top? Scientists call this process sort of the escalator to extinction, because if everything moves up from below and those at the top don't have any place to move, they will disappear. And we are now able to measure this, see this play out, particularly in some really great studies being done in tropical mountains and ridgetops, where old surveys are being compared to new surveys, and you realize, oh my gosh, these birds that were common at the top, or these moths that were common at the top, have disappeared or are disappearing because they have nowhere to go. So it's those specialized relationships that we fear most for in this era of change.
So this whole elevator effect that you mentioned here is it makes intuitive sense too. At the bottom of the elevator, is there something that is happening that is displacing this whole thing? Is there like a replacement going on downstairs, or is it still just turning into a desert or something like that?
It's a great question, and we don't have the answer entirely. There is, it's one of the questions. If everything's moving up, what's left down below? So one of the answers has to do with the similarity, if you will, between elevation and latitude, in that things don't just move up, they also move north in the northern hemisphere, or they move south in the southern hemisphere. In that if you go, we know this, if we're living in a cold place and we want to take a warm vacation, we tend to go south, right? Or vice versa. People living in southern warm places want to go skiing, they either go to a mountain or they go north. And the plants and animals are doing the same thing at a phenomenal rate. So we also see things moving latitudinally in response to this, as well as in terms of elevation.
That's really fascinating. And last time you blew me away with all the little whys that you've answered pertaining to nuts and seeds, like explaining how walnuts have their complex structure. I thought that was really cool. This time what blew me away was the trees moving at a certain velocity, which was fascinating. Like miles per decade? Like, that was crazy. Like, what's going on over there?
It's a great story, isn't it? We tend to think of trees as stationary, obviously, famously stationary. They don't move at all. But as a species, they can move in response to change. As the habitat moves, the rate at which trees get established in different parts of their range changes. So if trees do best in a certain temperature or a certain amount of moisture in their environment, if that's where they germinate the best and grow the best, then they shift. Their whole population can shift in that direction over time. And still, we would expect that to be a really slow process. But there was a fascinating study done recently in the eastern half of the United States, where they took all of this data that has been collected for decades. A huge amount of data. They needed a supercomputer to run this because it has been collected for so long. Little plots of what's growing where, collected by scientists, all stripes, but organized by our Forest Service. They have this huge amount of data. Go out and you count what's growing where in various places. And what they learned was that the trees were moving faster than, in some cases, faster than the birds. We have a lot of birds shifting their ranges as well, but there are trees that are outpacing many of the birds in this era of change, in that they are germinating and getting established in a certain direction, north, or also in some places moving to the west, where they're following differences in rainfall that climate change is producing. And they're moving, as you pointed out, by miles and miles every decade. The center of the ranges for these trees, you can calculate where are these trees most common, and that point, that imaginary point in the landscape, is racing ahead for dozens and dozens of tree species across eastern North America, but by proxy then across the world.
Okay, this is going to be a very general question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So what are some experiments or observations people can make at home and know more about climate change, or like sort of direct implications? Do they need to go out on a walk? Do they need to climb a mountain? What do they need to do? I know it's very general, but help me on this one.
Oh, I think it's a great question. And that's one of the interesting things. We can see it at home. We can see it in, the city park. You can see it in your backyard. You can see it in a window box planted right outside. One of the most intuitive ways to see climate change play out is to start paying attention to timing, and particularly the timing of springtime. When things start to bloom, when the leaves come out on trees, all of those things are changing fast. As temperatures rise, as springs get warmer, many species respond immediately. They sense, well, now it's spring, and they germinate, the seeds germinate, or the flowers bloom. These sorts of things, they happen based on temperature. And there is a wonderful example of how a backyard observation can really impact science, and that comes to us from Henry David Thoreau, the naturalist and philosopher who went to Walden Pond in the middle of the 19th century, and he wrote a famous book about his thoughts and his experiences there, sort of getting back to nature at that time. Well, he was also a meticulous observer of just those sorts of backyard conditions. When the flowers bloomed, he would note in his notebooks. When the birds arrived, he would note when he heard the first ones of these or that, or saw this, and he kept these meticulous notes for years. And nobody really knew about them outside of the, sort of Thoreau scholar world, which tends to be in the English department. But over in the biology department, when scientists began to hear that not only was Thoreau, a good writer and philosopher and so on, but he was a good scientist, well, oh my gosh, they opened up these old notebooks and found that he had recorded what is now one of the most valuable data sets in climate research, because it allows then people to look at modern dates for these things and have an accurate comparison, and learn that, in fact, the violets and the wood sorrel and the willows that Thoreau saw blooming in April or May or June are now starting in March and early April. The whole phenology, or the timing of those springtime events, has shifted for many species dramatically. And that's something you can see in your own backyard. Particularly if you start noting things like that, you could just write it on your calendar or enter it on your phone or what. I saw the lilacs blooming on a certain day this year, and then compare that over time. There are even ways now through citizen science projects to contribute that kind of data to broad data sets across the country, and see what other people are seeing, and see how this is playing out, how species are reacting to those warm early springs. And it's not subtle. You can see it over the course of just a few years.
If someone was to give you $1 billion, what are some places you would like to travel?
Oh, my goodness. Traveling and studying is, it's sort of fraught, though, when you're talking about climate change and your carbon footprint. the idea of traveling takes on a new nuance. You really have to be careful and make sure you're not traveling frivolously. But where you can find reason to move and gain insights and so forth as a scientist, it's still an important part of our research.
Just want to add, for the greater good.
For the greater good, exactly. Yeah. So not just to see what's happening, but to study about it. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, or one of the systems that I think is interesting, or the conditions, is where you have an organism that experiences many habitats over the course of its life history. And there are a lot of examples of these, but if you think about, I live in the Pacific Northwest, so you think about the Pacific salmon that begins life in a mountain stream and then lives in that freshwater system, experiencing all of the changes there as a tiny little organism, and eventually coming out into the salt water and moving through the nearshore environment, which is also going through all of these changes and all these species moving around and different temperatures and habitat changing, and then ends up as a larger creature out in the ocean for 1 year, 2 years, 3, 4 for some species, living in another totally different environment, and then coming back in reverse and re-experiencing all of those habitats on its way back to its spawning ground in the stream, but this time as a large predator with a different set of requirements. If you can stitch together those life histories, it's a really insightful way to see how climate change is impacting multiple systems all at once in different ways. And so I think if I had limitless research funds, I would study species like that, or in their comparable species like eels and others, these things that move from one totally different system to another. And their life histories then really tell us a lot about the breadth and the scope of change and the breadth and the scope of the responses to change.
Is this how a lot of research globally is conducted on this topic, where one scientist is following the trail of a certain species and then everybody just pulls in and shares?
Oftentimes that happens. And I think one of the most common trends in science right now is going out into the field expecting to study one thing and ending up studying something totally different because the conditions on the ground have changed. Not just the conditions in terms of temperature and other climate-related things, but the lives of the creatures that the scientist is there to study have changed. And so that is a very common trend, and something that scientists almost joke about now in biology. Like, gosh, everyone's studying climate change at this point. Some people just haven't realized it yet. But things are all changing so quickly that the systems that we're accustomed to are really in flux. And I think that provides a common ground for a lot of sharing of information and sharing of experience, and throwing questions around and trying to figure out what's going on, not just in the specialty that we have, but more broadly, how whole ecological systems are changing.
Could you give me an example of one thing that happened with you when you went on to look for something but found another thing? So
let me give you an experience that's not my own, but I think it is such a great example of this. This is from a researcher named Will Deasy, who studies bears. He studies brown bears, the big Kodiak Island brown bears in Alaska. Some of the largest grizzlies, if you will, in the world live on this island. And the idea has always been that bears eat a lot of salmon, and there are all these salmon runs on the island, and the bears feast on these salmon and they become enormous and very, famous for their size. And so Will loves bears. He was heading out to do this project because he wanted to understand how the bears knew or timed their movements around the island to always be at the salmon stream at the peak of the salmon run. Because the salmon move up these rivers and streams at different times. And so how do the bears, manage their time so well so they always seem to be in the right place at the right time? So he had gone up there and he had radio tagged 40 bears, and he had set up systems in the streams to count the salmon coming in, so he'd know when the salmon were most abundant, and he was going to study how the bears moved around and so on. And everything was going great. And then right in the middle of his field season, the peak salmon runs, the bears disappeared. They all picked up and left the streams, and he couldn't believe it. And he and his team said, well, luckily, we have the radio tags on them, so we'll follow them and find out where they're going. And the bears had all shifted, gone up into the hills around these streams to eat a particular kind of berry, the red elderberry, which is, in Will's words, a weird berry because it's not just full of sugars the way most berries are. We think of as sort of sweet. Red elderberry has all those carbohydrates, but it also has a lot of protein, which is unusual for a berry. And in that situation, the bears had chosen berries over fish because those berries there's something the bears always used to eat later in the late summer and early fall. When the salmon were starting to diminish, the bears would shift over and eat a range of berries, including these elderberries. But in this case now, with climate change, the berries have been the plants have been blooming earlier and bearing fruit earlier, and suddenly forced this dilemma where the bears had to choose. What is our favorite food? Do we eat salmon? Or if given the choice, will we choose elderberries? Because the elderberries were now at full fruit at the peak time of salmon harvest. And for the bears, it was a clear choice because it turns out that salmon, although the bears eat a lot of it, is not an ideal food for bears because what they're trying to do with all that consumption is put on a huge layer of fat so that they can go dormant, hibernate through the winter, and live off of those fat reserves. But if you're eating an almost pure protein diet, it's very difficult to put on fat. And we know this if anyone has ever experimented with some of these high protein diets that people go on, right? It's the same principle. If you're on the Atkins diet or the South Beach diet, you eat a whole bunch of protein because the body can't or has a harder time processing that into something it can store. So you eat a bunch of it, but you don't tend to put on the pounds. And the same is true for the bears. Getting too much protein, hard to put on fat. So given the choice, they made the switch to these berries that gave them a mixture of carbohydrates and protein that allowed them to put on fat quicker than on a diet of salmon alone. So here's a situation where climate change forced this choice and alerted scientists like Will to the fact that those berries had always been a vital part of the bear's diet, even more important than salmon. But scientists didn't realize it until climate change forced that obvious choice, and the bears made the switch.
Yeah, that was also in your book, and I thought that was a really, really fascinating story as well. So one question I have here is that what is something really intricate or tiny or hides from people's eyes but may have a huge impact on the entire world as a whole?
Sure. So if we look at relationships that are changing, one of the key relationships that, again, is something we don't pause to think about very often, but that is pollination. And pollination is, of course, essential not just to wild plants and the insects and other creatures that do the pollinating. But that relationship is, of course, integral to our food systems for a huge variety of crops. Not all crops. There are wind-pollinated crops, too, but a huge number of crops, fruits, vegetables, and other things that we eat rely upon insect pollination at some stage of that agricultural process. And pollination is a relationship in ecology that, again, is based on, in many cases, on timing, in that you have to have the insects doing the pollinating at the peak of their activity at the same time that the plants are at the peak of their flowering period. And when you start to tweak the climate in a rapid way, the way we are now, it can break apart those relationships in that not all plants and animals respond in the same way, and they don't always respond at the same time. And a great example of this would be, there are any number of them, but in our local flora here where I live, there's a wildflower called the death camas, and it is a deadly wildflower, but there's one bee that has figured out how to tolerate that poison. So the bee has this, exclusive source of pollen and nectar, and the plant has a very dedicated pollinator, and that relationship has co-evolved and developed over thousands, if not millions of years, to be a very tightly co-evolved relationship. But now what we observe is that the plant is blooming in our neck of the woods 2 weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago, because it's responding to air temperatures. The air is getting warmer in spring, and so the plant says, hey, it's warm enough to bloom, and it blooms. The bee, on the other hand, nests in the ground where temperatures are warming more slowly. And so it's very much on the old schedule. And if that situation continues, you could see what scientists call a timing mismatch, where those two codependent species are pulled apart, not in space, but in time. The flower blooming too early for its bee, and the bee emerging too late for its flower. And those fundamental relationships between bees and other insects and other pollinators and the plants that they interact with, in some cases, are threatened by rapid change. So that is one of those hidden aspects of climate change that could really haunt us in the future.
This reminds me of how we use almonds as one of our ingredients here. We're in California. I don't know. Where are you these days?
I live to the north of you in Washington State, out in the islands off the coast.
All right. If you ever drop by Napa Valley, just drop by us, give me a heads up, and we'll host you and take you to places where you've never been.
I would love it.
But yeah, over here, I think the big problem we've heard is the bees being attacked by a certain wasp or something like that. I'm not sure. Are you aware of something like that that's going on?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Luckily, it's not. I don't think it's in your neck of the woods yet. But the almond crop that you talk about relies heavily upon honeybees. Domestic honeybees, because you have all of this millions of acres, if you will. I can't even remember the total. I think it's over 1 million acres now of almonds in the Central Valley in California. They all come into bloom at once, and there aren't enough local bees in that habitat. Now it's been cleared mostly and replaced with crops of one kind or another. So the local bees are few in number. So honeybees must be brought in from all across the country at that time to pollinate all those almonds. Every almond in any of your products, interacted with a bee early in its existence. They must be pollinated to produce fruit, and that has to happen via bees for almonds. So you have a great dependence there upon honeybees and to some degree the native bees. To the north, here in Washington, we have recently been struggling with a non-native and invasive wasp, the Asian Giant Hornet, which was accidentally introduced into this country or perhaps into neighboring British Columbia, Canada, and has now made it across the border. And it's an interesting species in that it's an enormous wasp, and it has specialized in attacking other insects, particularly honeybees and other social bees and wasps, because when this hornet is at sort of the peak of its productivity late in the season, early in the season, individual wasps are attacking moth larvae and butterfly larvae and a variety of insects. But when their colonies get larger and larger, they have more mouths to feed, they start looking for a place where they can get a lot of bang for their buck. And one of the places they can would be in a hive of honeybees. And so these massive wasps have evolved to be very resistant to attack by honeybees, and they can come into a hive and in some cases, kill the entire colony, and then transfer all of that food back to their own colony. They take the dead bees, they take particularly the larvae, which are very tasty and easy to eat. So they can really decimate honeybee hives. So there's a great worry and fear, if you will, among beekeepers that this giant hornet will get established in North America and have a great impact on domestic honeybees. So it is an ongoing struggle here in the northern part of Washington state to try to find all of these Asian giant hornets and eliminate them before they establish a real foothold. And it's an open question now, honestly, as to whether or not they can be stopped. But there's certainly great effort going on.
Yes, one of my customers through one of my businesses, he talked to me about how this is a big issue. He has a bunch of bees over there. He was telling me how the way it's very difficult for bees to defend them. And one of the ways they do it, perhaps, I don't know if it's how correct this is, but is to increase the temperature around the hornet to a certain point where it kind of like kills it that way. But even then, like you said, they're a huge threat. One of them could knock out a bunch of them. So hopefully we can figure out solutions. So this brings us to a very interesting question, though. It's like, where do you let nature take its course? And when does a human being say, you know what, enough is enough. I need to get in there?
It's a great question and something that we debate a lot in science and in conservation. When do you take action, not just in terms of invasive species like the hornet, but in terms of climate change? Do we help creatures? If we, should we be moving creatures to the north, in the northern hemisphere, if they can't make it, but we know there's habitat for them? When do we assist their migration, if you will? These are really interesting and intriguing and important questions. Oftentimes, for scientists, it boils down to the degree of human involvement in terms of creating the problem. So if we have a situation like this Asian giant hornet, where we know darn well that the hornet didn't fly across the Pacific on its own. It arrived here probably accidentally in shipping and so forth coming from Asia. So we've created this problem. So there's one aspect of the equation. The consequences of the problem are great, not just for natural systems here, but also for human systems. So there's a great threat potentially. And there's still, because the hornet is only recently arrived, there's still the possibility of a good outcome. We might be able to contain it. No guarantees, but you have the possibility of success. And so when you add those things together, you have a situation where it makes a lot of sense to take action and to do as much as we can right now to try to contain that. There are other situations where one or more of those factors don't weigh in the right direction. I mean, we might want to be rid of a very well-established invasive weed species, for example, cheatgrass in the West, or any number of plants or other invaders that are well-established now and have caused harm to natural or human systems. But they're too widespread. They're already everywhere and well-established. We can't get rid of them. So the equation changes to something more of a management issue. But I think now what's interesting is to address these questions in terms of climate change, which is also a human-driven process, but more abstract in that it's a step away. We didn't pick up the brown pelican, for example, from your neck of the woods in California and bring the brown pelican to my neck of the woods in Washington state. We didn't do that directly, but we've warmed the atmosphere and changed the climate to the point where brown pelicans have made that move on their own because the temperatures here are now comfortable for them for much of the year. So we now have brown pelicans shifting northward and competing with the other birds that were here already and creating stress perhaps in that situation. But is it natural? Is it human driven? That's a situation where maybe nature plays out on its own and takes its own course. But we're going to be facing more and more of those conundrums as managers of, wildlife and natural spaces, because so many creatures are on the move from climate change, which at its base is this human-driven process, but now affecting thousands upon thousands of creatures.
Awesome. We've been burning through a lot of time, and it's close to about being an hour, and I don't want to take a lot of your time. I'll start wrapping things up. So what else can people expect from your book?
And sure. So it's a real exploration of many of the things we have been talking about in terms of plants and animals responding to climate change. And much of what we've measured to date has to do with changes in behavior, like the little seabird, the dovekie, changing its feeding behavior, or moving, like the brown pelicans moving north. A lot of changes to how people too, but how plants and animals behave or where they live, those sorts of plastic, flexible behaviors changing. But we are also now beginning to be able to measure evolution in response to climate change. And this is the teaser I will leave you and your listeners with, in that it is now possible to see that happen, evolution, measurable evolution, play out not over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, but in fact, even within a single field season. And a classic example of that comes from the title of the book. The hurricane lizards of the title are a marvelous little species of an old lizard in the Caribbean. They live on a couple of islands in the Turks and Caicos. And a researcher named Colin Donahue had just measured the populations there for another study. Again, going to study one thing and studying something else in the end. He had measured these populations, and then a hurricane struck. Or as he pointed out to me, it was 2 hurricanes back to back that flattened those islands, and the research project had to be put on hold. This larger study they were going to do involved removing non-native rats and watching the native ecosystem respond and so forth. They had to put all of that on hold, but Colin realized that presented an opportunity for him to try and study the impacts of the hurricanes. And so he went right back and found himself in this sort of scientific deja vu, repeating the exact same field study he had just completed 6 weeks earlier, and asking the question, are the survivors of these hurricanes, the surviving lizards, different? Will I see something different in the population of those that have withstood this incredible test, if you will, evolutionary test? And in fact, he did find differences. He found that the surviving hurricane lizards after the hurricanes had larger toe pads and stronger front legs for gripping, for gripping sticks and twigs and branches during high winds. And he also noticed that the back legs were smaller. And this was a mystery to him until he performed a series of experiments to try and observe lizards in high winds. Well, you can't bloody well go out in the middle of a hurricane and take notes. So he reenacted a hurricane in his hotel room while he was doing this research project with a leaf blower. And he had leaf blower going with with lizards on sticks. And he could see that when you reached a hurricane force wind, the lizards' bodies, their back legs would slip off the branch and their bodies would be flapping in the breeze like a flag. So what they needed to survive those conditions were the strong front legs and the big toe pads that held on tight, and then small back legs that reduced the drag on their bodies, so that they could hold on just long enough to survive until the winds died down. And so he was able to see that happen in a field season and then see it passed on to the next generation and document survival of the fittest, natural selection in action.
That's crazy. How long did it take to go through this observation to reach a substantial observation itself? Was it years or days?
That is the magic of it. It was 6 weeks. That population, because of the severity of that, evolutionary test, if you will, that challenge of those back-to-back hurricanes, he could see natural selection play out. The survivors were different physically, and they passed those differences onto their offspring, shifting that whole species in a slightly different direction, a step in their evolution that he could see as a result of climate change.
I think you need your own podcast, or at least like a social media presence. I know you do you even have social media at all?
I'm a little bit behind the times on such things. I have a website, and I do make some very short films for for PBS for their Nature program that they use on social media. But I don't have a social media presence myself.
I think you should at least get an Instagram or some sort of a visual media, because I saw your pictures, and I think you'll find similar like-minded people who will be interested in what you have to post over there, your observations. If there's some crazy person like me who's interested in your work, I'm sure there's going to be a few hundreds or thousands of them, and it would help you substantially, and it will feel like family. So do you have any final messages or something that you would like to add over here before we go to the final plugs?
The last thing that I will say is that what we learn out in nature, I believe, can really inform our own response to this crisis, in that we see, a teeny lizard that can evolve larger toe pads to deal with climate change. I think there's a certain inspiration we can take. Plants and animals are doing everything they can. Some will make it, some won't, but they're really, really doing their utmost to adapt. And I think we can take some inspiration then in our own behaviors, in what we do to try not just to adapt, but also to change the behaviors that are bringing the crisis about in the first place. Taking those small steps that we can all do as individuals in how we shop and how we eat and how we drive and how we vote and how we dry the laundry or cut the grass, all those tiny daily decisions that we make can be tweaked to help mitigate our use of energy. And when we do that collectively, I think it is a powerful, what we would call in science, a positive feedback loop. Because we all want to do something about climate change, but we feel daunted by the enormity of the challenge. Yet if we can do something small, you feel a little better and you want to do more. And so those small actions become really important in executing this cultural shift in our relationship to energy that we really need to address this crisis. And I think that it starts with individuals.
Totally agree with that one. And even as us as a business here at Ketogeek, we make our products, and I wouldn't say we're that great when it comes to the carbon footprint, but we're work in progress. We've made drastic changes in how we do our business. For example, one of the coolest things is the spoon that we use. It's made from paperboard. And one of the fascinating thing that the company, it's over here in California, about 40 minutes down south from us, they support regenerative forestry, which I think is really awesome. So if they chop down something, they're going to plant some more because of that. And then there's Strauss Family Creamery right next doors to us, and the butter, it's amazing. I don't know if you ever tried it. It's amazing butter. It's really, really good. And it's pricier, but one of the good things about their butter is that they're trying their best to keep sort of like a carbon neutral sort of environment when it comes to their activities, trying to use methane, for example, and those kind of things. They're trying to use the manure actually to produce some sort of fuel for their own farm. So small steps, we're doing what we can, and I'm sure people listening to this show will do what they can as well. And collectively as a civilization, it will reflect. So how can people buy your book? Where can they go? And how can they find you besides email and web? I mean, you can tell me your email and website as well. Everything. Just show me everything that you want to. Just tell me everything you want to tell everybody.
Sure. Well, this book and the others are available at any local independent bookstore. They're available at all the online bookstores as well. They're widely available, and I hope that folks will enjoy them. And if you want to connect with me, otherwise, I do have a website, which is Thor Hanson, THORHANSON.net. That is the website that tracks my various projects, and there's a contact page there as well.
And just to give everybody an idea, what other books have you written, just in case people are curious about them?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So the first book that I wrote was about working with endangered mountain gorillas over in Uganda. That's called The Impenetrable Forest. And then I wrote a book, believe it or not, all about the history and evolution, natural history and human history of feathers. Fascinating stuff that got me everywhere from dinosaurs in China to showgirls in Las Vegas. And then I wrote a book, which I think we talked about before, which was all about the natural history and evolution of seeds. And then also one about bees and how they are essential to us and often overlooked, but our relationship and the evolution, of course, and biology of bees and our relationship with them.
Oh, so I swear there's a podcast between us waiting for each and every single book, and I feel like I just scraped, like people talking about the tip of the iceberg. I feel like I just put a shovel on the tip of the iceberg right now. So, but this is really good. Thank you so much for being on with us, and we'll have you back once again. You got anything planned in the future, like a future project for anything in mind?
Oh yeah, I always have a few things going, and right now I'm working on a book about the biology of your backyard. So some of the things we actually began talking with early on in this interview about how much we can see right in our own backyard, and how with the advent of the internet and citizen science, how we can really participate in big biological research questions from climate change down to the behavior of particular creatures by paying more attention to what we see close by.
All right, well, sounds good. Thor, you've been a great guest as always, very educational, and I'm sure people will love this episode as well, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can visit us at Ketogeek.com to check out our premium keto-friendly and low-carb food products, including our infamous energy pods, made from the best ingredients we could find in the entire country. We also recommend signing up for our newsletter at ketogeek.com/signup, where you get exclusive discounts, rewards, product announcements, and the latest content we are working on. You also get a 10% discount on your entire order when you sign up. Go to ketogeek.com/signup to join the low-carb playground.